There are 4 parts to the test. Part 1. You will hear part of a lecture about a 19th century scientist who made an important discovery. For questions 1 to 8, complete the sentences.
The subject of my talk today is an inventor by the name of William Perkins. Now, I can see that his name isn't very familiar to you, but I can assure you that his pioneering discovery in the mid-19th century was incredibly influential, and the results are still very much to be seen around us every day. Now, when he made his discovery, Perkins was only 18 years old and still a student. His father had tried to dissuade the young William in his choice of chemistry as his university subject, perceiving it as too academic and unlikely to provide a good living. Instead, Mr. Perkins Sr. urged young William to follow his older brother into architecture. Wisely, William followed his own inclination, and it was he who went on to found the highly profitable family business. But I've raced ahead a bit, because when the 18-year-old research student began his pioneering experiment in his room in 1856, what he was actually looking for was an artificial form of the substance called quinine. In the 1840s and 50s, malaria, the illness spread by mosquito bites, was rife, and quinine was the only known cure. This substance was made from the bark of a rather scarce tree, and so was limited in supply and very expensive. Perkins' professor had a theory that quinine could be produced artificially, that it might be a byproduct of the process by which gas, of the type we still use for cooking and heating, was extracted from coal. That's why Perkins was set to work on this series of experiments. Instead, however, of producing the colourless quinine he had been hoping for, Perkins' experiments resulted in a red-coloured powder. A lesser lad would have thrown it away in disgust, but Perkins, inspired by a desire to understand what had happened, continued to experiment with the powder. When some of it spilled onto his clothing and stained it a deep purple, he realised that he had produced something useful in quite another sphere. Because, by accident, William Perkins had come up with a dye that could be used to change the colour of textiles. Until then, most clothes had been either black, white, or in fairly natural brownish colours. Bright-coloured material was possible, but it was very expensive, as the dyes that were used came from organic sources, largely plants and insects. And you needed large quantities of organic material to produce the right effects. What's more, the dyes tended to have a fatal flaw. They were not permanent. The colour came out in the wash, or even worse, in the rain. Perkins' discovery was, therefore, the first synthetic dye. Not only was it permanent, but it could be produced in large quantities and cheaply. This effectively marked the beginning of the artificial colour-dyeing industry.
That is the end of Part 1. Part 2. You will hear a radio programme on the subject of kites. For questions 9 to 16, complete the sentences.
A kite is a light structure which flies in the wind at the end of a length of string. It's only in recent years that kite flying has caught on as a major international sport, a development triggered by the invention of the now familiar two-line or stunt kite. The first written reference to kites, however, has been found in China and dates back 2,500 years. Indeed, the flying of kites has always played an important cultural and artistic role in many parts of Asia, particularly Japan and India. Throughout history, kites have served a variety of functions. In ancient times, they were principally used for hunting, making them an important element in assuring food supplies in some parts of the world. They've also featured in some famous firsts. For example, radio pioneer Guglielmo Marconi used one to hoist the aerial for the first transatlantic radio transmission. And a kite carried the first line over the Niagara Gorge in North America to mark the beginning of the building of the famous suspension bridge there in 1846. Kites are also a means of harnessing wind power, and are capable of pulling quite large weights in the right wind conditions. For example, for many years, kites have been successfully used to pull sleds across the ice in polar regions. This perhaps being the origin of the sport of kite buggying, where kites pull people along at high speed in three-wheeled carts on various surfaces, including ice. This ability to transport people may explain the fascination with kites over the centuries, since they offered the most tangible hope that one day people might fly. Indeed, when the Wright brothers successfully produced the first flying machine, it bore a strong resemblance to an existing box kite design. There is a kite festival taking place every week somewhere in the world, and this weekend sees one of the world's largest taking place in France. Just how popular kites have become will be evident from the 10,000 flyers, and 250,000 people will pay to go along and watch. Indeed, so popular has the hobby of kite flying become that more than 50 million are sold every year in the US alone. Activities at the festival will include various American and Asian manufacturers showing off their latest designs in spectacular displays, as well as wonderful aerial battles fought between magnificent Japanese fighting kites. Their lines are coated with ground glass, so that they cut through those of the enemy. So what's next for kites? Rumour has it that the next craze to hit the sport is for kites that can be flown indoors. Strange thought, but ideal for those of us who are not so keen to venture outside in high winds. As far as kite flying is concerned, it seems that the sky's the limit.
That is the end of Part 2. Part 3. You will hear an interview with a woman who runs a record label. For questions 17 to 23, choose the best answer, A, B, C or D.
My guest today is Tessa Notley, whose record label has launched some of the leading pop bands of the last decade. Tessa, welcome.
Hi.
So, how did you come to start your own record label?
Oh, it's in the blood. My father is a record producer, and when I left school, I went to work with him in his studio. But at that age, I really wanted to make my own way in the world, so I soon moved on, and after about 6 months doing temporary secretarial work, I decided to sign up for a course and train to be a maths teacher. After that, I taught for about 2 years before leaving to set up my own label.
And presumably the maths comes in handy when you're setting up a business.
Actually, it was being a temporary secretary that helped. I worked for all sorts of people, far removed from the music industry. It was a tremendous experience because I got a chance to see how different companies are set up and structured, and how the managers dealt with the staff. It's amazing what you can glean if you keep your eyes and ears open. I would always advocate starting at the bottom and working your way up in any business. If you're going to head any sort of team, it's better if you've actually experienced being a team member yourself. You're much better able to help and be supportive.
But it's you who spots the bands, isn't it?
Well, I can't take all the credit, but my colleagues say that I'm blessed with what they call punter's ears. So I tend to like things that are potentially big hits. The more obscure things that the producers maybe like because they're interesting musically, pass me by a little.
And is that how you judge it? Literally, I like that song, sign them up.
I think over the years you get a slightly more professional view than that, but often that's what it comes down to in the end. There are, of course, many other criteria that have to be met, as well as is the song a hit, but that is without a doubt the crucial one. But you've also got to ask yourself, does this artist have what it takes? You know, our industry is full of one-hit wonders, people for whom the door has been opened, but they've been unable to walk through it. And there's a lot of choices that artists have to make once they've had their initial success. And some of them make the right choices, and some of them make the wrong ones.
Now, the first big hit song that you really spotted was one called Be That As It May. You never really got the credit for spotting it, though, did you?
No, I didn't, but that's not the point. That experience taught me a lot about the business. What actually happened was that a couple of hours before the band was due to come in and start recording for me, with what I believed was a signed agreement, I got a call saying that one of the really big recording companies had offered the band a fortune to sign for them instead. And it was thousands of % more than I was paying them. And I said, whatever you do, don't waste the studio time. You're booked in, so come along anyway, and we'll discuss it. But I really couldn't match the offer, even though, in retrospect, there was a freedom in my deal that would have suited them very much better later on. Anyway, at the time, they made the logical choice. I was annoyed, but I don't hold it against them. I found other bands who were equally, if not more, successful.
Indeed. So much so, actually, that you were nominated for the Businesswoman of the Year award 2 years ago. But you've confessed that you were gutted when you didn't actually win it. Why was that?
My name was put forward by a dear friend of mine called Lucy, unbeknownst to me, and suddenly I was in a race that I hadn't even really thought about, and certainly wouldn't have put myself in for. But once you're in it, of course you want to win. I think anybody would, so it's a big letdown when it doesn't happen. And although, you know, we all know that someone has to lose, I guess it dents your pride a bit.
Now, you say that your favourite part of the whole business is negotiating, getting the best deal. Do you really still find it so exciting?
Well, it's not exciting so much as interesting. I like to see the positions that other people take. I'm always intrigued to see their reactions to the points I raise. You learn an enormous amount about people during the process of a negotiation. It gets quite intimate at times. Because I don't adopt an aggressive pose, it's more about listening to people and working out what kind of deal is going to be attractive to them within the bounds of what I have to offer.
Tessa, there we have to leave it. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you.
That is the end of Part 3. Part 4. Now look at the fourth and last part of the test. You will hear 5 short extracts in which various people are talking about games that are played in their family. For questions 24 to 33, choose the best answer, A, B or C. Speaker 1.
Playing card games has always been important. My parents started teaching my brother and I how to play the game called Bridge on holiday one year. We were an argumentative pair, but Dad had the patience to persevere, and it was worth it. I guess learning bridge young is a bit like learning languages young. You pick it up more easily. I mean, we already liked games of all sorts, but it was bridge that really grabbed our attention. I'm quite competitive, and I love the challenge of talented opponents, but the game can be taken far too seriously. Fundamentally, it's about sociability rather than winning, irrespective of the level you're playing at, and that's what you have to keep in mind.
Speaker 2.
My children have an evening playing board or card games at least once a week, more often if they wish, and the choice of actual activity is left up to them. But then again, because people need to interact, we've agreed to ration the amount of free time which gets spent looking at television or computer screens. And then we have regular music and poetry evenings, as well as game sessions. And nobody in the family gets away without taking centre stage. We let visitors do karaoke, or tell jokes if they're not keen on performing. And although some of our relations say they find even the thought of doing that excruciating, afterwards they're always thrilled to have taken part.
Speaker 3. We've got a cupboard full of board games, and lots on computer as well. I always feel games are a great equaliser. We get the games out whenever we have visitors, because they break the ice, especially with people you don't know so well. You don't have to worry about making small talk or whatever. because you've got a ready-made topic of conversation. My dad runs a company that makes board games, and he's waging a campaign to try and wake people up to the idea that these games are not just leisure pursuits, they're sort of sports of the mind, which should be promoted the way that sports are promoted, because they're equally therapeutic, just in a different way. Speaker 4.
We tend to frown on half-hearted players in our family. As a kid, you feel pleased with yourself the first time the adults let you beat them, but it's a feeling you're expected to grow out of pretty quickly. We rarely play for money or prizes, and that's because games are an opportunity to pit your wits against the other people who are also giving it their best. That's the challenge. So, whether we play cards or a board game, we always keep a running total of defeats and victories. So there's always a chance to settle old scores next time around. And that, I suppose, is what keeps me playing so fervently.
Speaker 5.
About once a month, the whole family gets together for a Sunday afternoon games session. In the summer, we take games with us to the beach, or the park, or wherever. And complete strangers will come over and say, "What game's that?" Because they can see we're having a good time. And more often than not, they've never even heard of it, which I think is such a shame. So although the interruptions do get boring, it's nice to think we're spreading the word. My favourites are the traditional word games. But I don't mind having a go at whatever's the latest craze, because unless you try these things, you end up like those people in the park, don't you?
That is the end of part 4. That is the end of the test.